Jake Morrison stood in the center of the Galactic Council chamber and felt the weight of 47 alien species staring at him with something between contempt and amusement. The chamber was massive and cold and designed to make visitors feel small, but Jake had stopped feeling small about 6 months ago when he realized that the Council would never treat humanity as equals no matter what they did or how hard they tried. Behind him stood 3 other humans, and they were the only ones in this vast space who understood what was about to happen. Lisa Patterson was a military commander with ice in her veins, and she had seen enough council meetings to know that diplomacy here was just another word for submission. Greg Hamilton was an admiral who had spent decades defending human colonies that the council claimed to protect, but never actually helped. Karen Wells was a diplomat who had tried every peaceful method to get fair treatment and had been dismissed every single time. They all knew this was the end, but it was also a beginning. The Velcrene matriarch floated in her section of the chamber, and her translucent body shimmered. With what humans had learned meant she was feeling superior and dismissive. She spoke through the translation device that made her water-like sounds into words everyone could understand, and her tone was exactly what Jake expected. She asked if humanity was really serious about leaving the council over such small problems, and she said the word small like she was talking to children who did not understand the real world. Jake felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice calm and clear because losing his temper now would give them exactly what they wanted. He asked her if she really thought it was small that human ships were banned from half the trade routes in the galaxy. He asked if she thought it was small that human colonies had been attacked, and the council refused to even investigate. He asked if she thought it was small that humanity had discovered new mining territories, but the council gave the rights to other species instead. The Thaxian delegate made a sound, like wind chimes in a storm, and the translation came through sharp and irritated. The Thaxians were beings made of crystal and geometry, and they had been in space for thousands of years before humans even invented the wheel. The delegate said that humanity had only been part of the council for 200 years, and that other species had waited much longer for the privileges that humans were demanding. Jake almost laughed at that because it was the same excuse they always used. He told them that humanity was not demanding special privileges, but just wanted the same rights that had been promised when they joined. He said that the council had denied those rights at every turn because humans were young and different and asked too many questions and expanded too fast and did not know their place, and the matriarch rippled in a way that showed anger. And she told Jake that humans were like children playing at adult politics and that they knew nothing about the delicate balance that the council had maintained for 10,000 years. Jake smiled then, and it was not a friendly smile at all. He said she was right about one thing, and that was that humanity was done playing their political games. He turned to face his delegation, and they all stood at the same moment like they had practiced it 100 times. Together they walked toward the massive doors that would take them out of the chamber and away from the council forever. The matriarch called after them, and her voice echoed in the vast space. She said that if humanity left, they would lose all protection under council law, and that they would be alone in a very dangerous galaxy. Jake stopped at the door and looked back at her, and at all the aliens who had spent 2 centuries treating humans like unwanted guests at a party they could never really join. He said that humanity had been alone since the day they arrived, and that the council had just made them pay for pretending otherwise. Then he walked through the doors and heard them seal shut behind him with a sound that felt final and absolute. None of the council members noticed the small smile on Jake's face as he left, because they were too busy feeling satisfied that they had put the arrogant humans in their place. They did not understand that humanity had been preparing for this moment for years. They did not know about the secret meetings with other species that the council ignored or exploited. They did not know about the network of trade stations and supply depots that humans had built across the frontier. They did not know that when you push someone out of your club, you better make sure they cannot build a better club somewhere else. Jake and his team walked through the station that surrounded the council chamber and headed toward their ship. Around them, other species moved about their business, and some of them watched the humans leave with curiosity, while others looked away like they were embarrassed. Lisa walked close to Jake and asked quietly if he thought they had done the right thing. Jake looked at her and saw the doubt in her eyes, but also the determination. He told her that staying would have meant accepting that humanity would always be second-class citizens in a galaxy that needed them, but did not respect them. He said that leaving meant they could build something new and something fair and something that gave every species an actual voice. Greg added that the military analysis was clear and that the Council was weak and complacent and had not fought a real war in centuries. He said their protection was mostly reputation and threat and very little actual capability. Karen said that economically the Council was more dependent on human trade and logistics than they realized, and that pulling out would hurt them more than they expected. Jake nodded at all of this because it was true, but he also knew that the real reason they were leaving was simpler than strategy or economics. They were leaving because staying meant losing who they were as a people. Their ship was waiting in the docking bay, and it was a human design, sleek and efficient and nothing like the ornate vessels that Council species preferred. As they boarded, Jake took one last look at the Council station and thought about all the meetings and arguments and rejections that had led to this moment. He thought about the human colonies that had begged for help and been ignored. He thought about the traders who had been cheated, and the explorers who had been denied, and the diplomats who had been humiliated. Then he thought about what came next and smiled again. The ship pulled away from the station and set course for human space, and as they entered the jump that would take them home, Jake knew that the galaxy was about to learn something important about humanity. They were about to learn that humans did not give up and did not forget, and most importantly, did not need permission to succeed. 3 months after humanity walked away from the Galactic Council, the cracks in the galaxy's economy started to show, and nobody in the Council understood why at first. The Velcrene commercial fleet was preparing for their regular route through the Kepler Traverse, when their navigation computers showed something strange. The 7 human way stations that had always been there were simply gone. Not destroyed or damaged, but removed completely like they had never existed at all. The Velcrene fleet commander was confused and angry, and demanded an explanation from the nearest Council monitoring post. The response took hours to arrive, and when it did, the tone was bureaucratic and cold. The message said that humanity was no longer bound by Council commercial agreements because they had withdrawn from the Council, and that the stations had been human property, so humans were free to move them wherever they wanted. The Velcrene commander stared at the message and realized that their supply route had just become 40% longer, and that meant 40% more fuel and 40% more time and 40% more cost. But this was just the beginning, and soon reports started coming in from across Council space. Human facilities were disappearing everywhere. Trading posts that had served travelers for decades were shutting down. Repair docks that had been essential stops on major routes were packing up and leaving. Fuel depots were closing without warning. At first, the Council thought this was some kind of punishment or economic warfare, but the truth was simpler and more devastating. Humans were just taking their things and going home. On the human vessel Resolute, Captain Nicole Barnes read through the reports with satisfaction. Every human facility along the major trade routes had been successfully relocated to human-controlled space, or to the territories of species that were not part of the Council. Her first officer was a man named Ben Foster, and he had been tracking the economic data with the enthusiasm of someone watching their team win a championship. He told Nicole that all the way stations from the Kepler Traverse had been moved, and that every human outpost along the Council trade routes was now either gone or repurposed for different uses. Nicole asked about the independent operators because she knew that not all human business was done under the human flag. Ben pulled up a star chart and showed her something remarkable. He explained that the Council had always complained about human entrepreneurship and how humans opened businesses everywhere and did not follow traditional patterns. What the Council never realized was that about 70% of the independent trading, posts and repair facilities and fuel depots in Council space were actually owned or operated by humans but hidden behind shell companies and local partnerships. Nicole raised her eyebrows because even she had not known the number was that high. Ben continued with obvious pleasure in his voice. He said that the Velcrene commercial routes had just gotten 40% longer, and that the Thaxian crystal shipments now had to bypass 3 entire sectors, and that the Meridian trade network had just lost its primary logistics hub. Nicole asked about the Council itself, and Ben's smile got wider. He told her that the Council's central supply chain for goods that could not be replicated had just discovered they had been dependent on human logistics for 50 years but never knew it because humans had operated through intermediaries and partnerships. Nicole leaned back in her chair and asked how long it would take the council to understand what was happening. Ben thought about it and said they were starting to notice the problems, but that understanding would take a few more weeks because they kept thinking in terms of political punishment instead of simple economic reality. On Earth, in the sprawling complex that housed the United Nations Space Command, Fleet Admiral Ryan Cooper stood before a massive holographic display of human space. The display showed something that would have seemed impossible 3 months ago. Humanity had established 17 new colonies and fortified 32 border systems, and started construction on 12 new shipyards. His aide was a woman named Amy Walsh, and she approached with news that made Ryan smile. She told him they were receiving requests for negotiation from 15 different species, and that none of them were council members. Ryan asked if these were the fringe worlds, and Amy confirmed it. She explained that these species were the ones the council considered too primitive or too aggressive or too independent for membership. They wanted to talk about trade and technology exchange and mutual defense. Ryan nodded slowly because this was exactly what Jake Morrison had predicted in his contingency plans. The enemy of my enemy might not be your friend, but they could definitely be your trading partner. Amy continued and said that some of these species had resources and territories that the council had prevented them from exploiting. She suggested that if humanity helped them develop those resources, then humanity would not be isolated at all, but would instead be the center of a whole new network that the council did not control. Ryan looked at the star map with growing satisfaction. He told Amy to proceed with negotiations, but to make sure these species understood one thing clearly. Humanity did not build empires and did not want colonies. Humanity wanted partnerships with equals. Amy said she would make that clear, but mentioned that the concept of equal partnerships was causing quite a stir because apparently the council's definition of partnership was very different from the human one. Ryan allowed himself a small smile and said that the council was about to learn that humanity wrote its own definitions. Across council space, reports were flooding in about economic disruptions and supply chain failures and increased costs. Species that had never paid attention to human businesses suddenly realized how much they had depended on human services. The repair technician who fixed your ship engines was human. The software that made your communication systems work with alien technology was human-designed. The fuel additives that made long-range travel efficient were human-manufactured. The spare parts for 1,000 different systems came from human factories. All of it was quietly disappearing, or becoming much more expensive to obtain. The Corvian ambassador was one of the first to understand the scope of the problem. His species had always been traders and merchants, and they understood supply chains better than most. He brought his analysis to the council's economic directorate and laid out the situation in stark terms. He showed them charts of trade routes and logistics networks and supply chains. He showed them how everything had been connected 3 months ago and how it looked now. The difference was shocking. Thousands of nodes in the network had simply vanished, and the entire structure had destabilized. The other council members did not want to believe it at first. They argued that humans were just one species, and that the galaxy had existed long before humans arrived. But the Corvian ambassador was patient and thorough. He explained that humans had never been just one species doing one thing. They had been everywhere and in everything and providing services that other species had not even realized they were using. He showed them that humans had not made themselves indispensable through some clever plot. They had just made themselves useful, and the council had become dependent on that usefulness while simultaneously treating humans as inferior. The Velcrene matriarch finally had to acknowledge the reality of the situation. She convened an emergency session of the council, and for once there was no pretense of superiority or calm control. Species that had never agreed on anything were united in their concern about the economic disruption. The matriarch asked how this could have happened and how one species leaving could cause so much damage. The answer was uncomfortable but undeniable. The council had spent centuries building a system that benefited the powerful and ignored the contributions of the supposedly lesser species. Humans had been essential to making that system work, but had been denied the recognition and respect they deserved. Now they were gone and the system was falling apart. In the silence that followed, one junior aide dared to speak up. He suggested that perhaps the council should consider negotiating with humanity to restore some of the economic relationships. The matriarch's response was sharp and immediate. She said that the Council did not negotiate with species who abandoned their responsibilities. But even as she said it, everyone in the chamber knew it was empty pride. The truth was that humanity had not abandoned responsibilities. They had simply stopped accepting disrespect while providing essential services. The galaxy was learning a hard lesson about the difference between power and capability. 6 months after humanity left the Galactic Council, something new was growing in the spaces between the stars. On a human frontier station called Atlas Point, Chief Engineer Danny Wright sat across from a delegation of aliens that the Council had always dismissed as primitive. The Corvin were reptilian and quick-moving, and their eyes were sharp with intelligence that the Council had never bothered to recognize. Their leader was named Susik, and he was explaining something that made Danny shake his head in disgust at the Council's arrogance. Susik told Danny that his world had lithium deposits that were 98% pure and that this was incredibly rare in the galaxy. Danny looked at the geological surveys and whistled low because he knew what lithium that pure was worth. He asked why the Corvin were not rich beyond measure if they had such valuable resources. Susik's expression darkened and he explained that the Council had declared the Corvin lacked the technological sophistication to trade lithium safely. What that really meant was that the Council wanted to keep the Corvin dependent while Council species extracted the resources through intermediaries at bargain prices. Danny felt anger rising in his chest because this was exactly the kind of exploitation that had driven humanity away from the Council. He put down his tablet and made the Corvin an offer that seemed to shock them. He said that humanity would provide the refining technology and the training to use it, and in exchange, humanity wanted a trade agreement for the refined lithium at fair market rates. Real market rates that would be independently verified, not the garbage prices the Council had been paying. Susik stared at Danny like he had just offered something impossible. He asked if humanity would really give them the technology outright without leasing it or maintaining control. Danny explained that it was their resource and their world, and that humanity believed in free trade, not colonial extraction. He pulled up a contract template and showed Susik what humanity was proposing. Humanity wanted preferred trading partner status and the right to maintain a small logistics outpost in Corvin space, but this would benefit both sides. The Corvin would get regular freight service and access to human trade networks, and humanity would get a reliable supply of lithium and a strategic trade route. Susik looked at his fellow delegates and Danny could see them having a silent conversation through gestures and expressions. Finally, Susik looked back and said that the Council would not be pleased about this arrangement. Danny laughed and said that the Council had not been pleased with humanity for 200 years, and that humans had learned to live with it. The real question was whether the Corvin wanted to keep living under the Council's thumb, or if they wanted to actually participate in galactic commerce as equals. Susik's eyes brightened and he asked when they could begin. Danny told him that human engineers could be on his world within 2 weeks, and that the first shipment of refined lithium could happen within 3 months. As the Corvin delegation left with obvious excitement, Danny sent a message to Jake Morrison with a simple note that said the plan was working better than expected. Similar conversations were happening across 24 systems in what had once been considered the galactic frontier. The Talnari were an agricultural species whose crops had unique nutritional properties, but the Council had kept their prices artificially low for centuries. Now human traders were offering fair prices and helping them expand their production. The Voss were a species whose mathematical abilities exceeded most Council members, but who had been denied advanced technology because the Council said they were too young. Now humanity was sharing computer systems and the Voss were creating calculation programs that made human navigation and targeting systems twice as effective. The Broken Claw clans were warriors whose culture the Council found distasteful because it was too direct and aggressive. But humanity recognized that the Broken Claw had honor and discipline, and most importantly, they controlled territory at the edge of the Kepler Traverse. Human military advisors were now training with Broken Claw fighters, and the combination of human technology with Broken Claw tactics was creating something formidable. Each species that joined this growing network brought something valuable, and each one had been ignored or exploited by the Council for reasons that had nothing to do with their actual capabilities. On Earth, Jake Morrison stood in his new office, which served as headquarters for what they were now calling the Human Trade Alliance. The name had been Karen Wells' idea because it emphasized cooperation and mutual benefit instead of dominance. Behind Jake's desk was a massive star map showing human space and the territories of their new partners marked in green. His assistant Claire Rodriguez brought him the latest statistics, and the numbers were remarkable. Humanity now had formal trade agreements with 23 independent species, and another 12 agreements were in negotiation. The economic models projected that within 18 months, the Human Trade Alliance would have a larger combined economic output than the Council's core members. Jake asked about military capabilities because economic power meant nothing if you could not defend yourself. Claire pulled up another display and explained that individually, all the Alliance species were smaller powers, but together they were becoming formidable. The Voss mathematical modeling combined with human computer systems had produced targeting solutions that were frankly frightening in their accuracy. The broken claw tactics integrated with human fleet coordination meant they could strike fast and hard and vanish before the enemy could respond. Each species brought something unique to the military equation, and together they were creating a defensive capability that was greater than the sum of its parts. Jake looked at the map and at all the green markers spreading across what had once been empty frontier space. He said that the Council had wanted humanity isolated, but instead the Council had isolated itself. Claire nodded and added that they were receiving quiet inquiries from some minor Council members who were asking about the possibility of joining the Alliance. These were not official requests yet because those species were afraid of Council retaliation, but they were asking, and that meant they were thinking about alternatives. Jake told Claire to respond carefully to those inquiries. He said to let them know the Alliance was open to new members, but only if they came as equals and only if they were willing to commit to fair trade and mutual defense. He did not want species joining just to hedge their bets or to play both sides. The Alliance was built on trust and shared values, and that meant members had to actually believe in what they were building. News of the Human Trade Alliance was spreading through the galaxy faster than anyone had expected. Independent traders were talking about the fair prices and reliable contracts they got from human partners. Colonies on the frontier were sharing stories about human aid and technology transfers that came without strings attached. Small species that had always been afraid of the Council's power were quietly reaching out to human diplomats to learn more about this new network. The Council tried to dismiss the Alliance as a temporary reaction to humanity's departure. They told themselves that the fringe species would eventually come crawling back because they needed the stability and protection that only the Council could provide. But the reports from their own economic analysts told a different story. The Alliance was not just surviving but thriving. Trade was growing. New colonies were being established. Technologies were being shared and improved. Most troubling of all, the species in the Alliance seemed genuinely happy with their arrangements in a way that Council members rarely did. The Velcrene matriarch called another emergency session, and this time the topic was not just economics but the political threat of the Alliance. She argued that humanity was building an alternative power structure that challenged the Council's authority, and that this could not be allowed to continue. But when she asked what actions the Council should take, the chamber fell silent. Nobody wanted to admit that the Council had no good options. Military action against the Alliance would be expensive and might unite all the fringe species against them. Economic sanctions would hurt the Council as much as the Alliance. And doing nothing meant watching the Council's influence slowly erode as more species saw the Alliance as a better alternative. In that silence, old Vexel the Meridian spoke up. He had been warning the Council about underestimating humanity for months and nobody had listened. Now he said something that made everyone uncomfortable. He said that maybe the Council should consider that humanity had not built something threatening, but had built something better. He said that perhaps the Council's real fear was not that the Alliance would destroy them, but that it would make them irrelevant. The matriarch's translucent form darkened with anger, but she did not respond, because deep down she knew he was right. The galaxy was changing, and for the first time in 10,000 years, the Galactic Council was not the one controlling that change. The species they had dismissed and exploited were finding their own path forward, and they were doing it without Council permission or Council oversight. The age of assumed superiority was ending, and the Council did not know how to stop it. The attack came without warning and without mercy. The Devourers emerged from the darkness beyond known space like nightmares made real. They were ancient and terrible, and they had ended civilizations long before the Velcrene had even discovered fire. The Council's early warning systems detected them too late, because the systems had grown old and complacent like everything else about the Council. By the time the alarms finally sounded, 3 outlying colonies had already gone silent, and everyone knew what that meant. In the Galactic Council chamber, panic replaced 10,000 years of assumed superiority. The Thaxian delegate was making sounds like breaking glass and demanding immediate activation of all defensive pacts. Every member species was supposed to contribute ships to a unified defense fleet. The Meridian Admiral in charge of Council forces displayed the tactical analysis, and the numbers were grim. Even with full mobilization, the Council could field perhaps 3,000 capital ships. Intelligence estimates put the Devourer fleet at over 10,000 vessels, and those vessels were designed specifically to overwhelm and consume. A Threan counselor suggested negotiation because the Devourers had accepted tribute before. The matriarch's form flickered with rage, and she asked if the counselor seriously wanted to surrender entire worlds to be consumed. The counselor replied that sacrificing some worlds was better than losing all worlds. The argument spiraled into chaos as different species tried to calculate which colonies they could afford to sacrifice and which ones were too valuable to lose. In all the shouting and fear, nobody seemed to remember that they had spent the last 6 months pushing away the one species that had actually prepared for threats like this. Finally, a junior aide spoke up, nervously, and mentioned that humans had kept extensive files on the Devourers. Humanity had been quite interested in defense scenarios against extragalactic threats, even though the Council had dismissed those concerns as paranoid fear-mongering. The chamber fell silent, and the matriarch said coldly that humans were no longer part of the Council, and what they knew was irrelevant. But old Vexel spoke up again and asked if human knowledge was really irrelevant when the Devourer fleet was heading directly through what used to be neutral space and what was now under the human trade Alliance defensive sphere. The Thaxian delegate made a sound of confusion and asked why the Alliance would care, since the Devourers were attacking Council worlds, not human territories. Vexel just said one word in response, and that word was yet. The implication hung in the air like a threat. The Devourers would not stop with Council space. If they broke through here, they would keep going, and eventually they would reach human space and Alliance space. The question was whether humanity would help the Council, or whether humanity would let the Council face the consequences of their arrogance alone. On the human vessel Defiant, Admiral Ryan Cooper studied the tactical display with the cold calculation of someone who had spent decades preparing for exactly this scenario. The Devourer fleet was massive, but it was following predictable patterns that humanity had studied for years, while the Council dismissed human concerns about extragalactic threats. Commander Amy Walsh approached and told Ryan that they had received a transmission from the Council requesting military assistance under mutual defense protocols. Ryan raised an eyebrow and noted that those were the same protocols the Council had voided when humanity left. Amy said the Council was claiming the threat superseded political disagreements, which was convenient for them. Ryan asked about human fleet status, and Amy reported that they had 200 capital ships in range and another 500 that could reach the conflict zone in 4 days. Their alliance partners were also mobilizing. The Broken Claw clans were sending their entire raiding fleet, which meant 300 fast and aggressive ships. Ryan thought about it carefully and asked about Council forces. Amy said they were scrambling and disorganized, and that the Council fleet had not fought a major engagement in 3 centuries. Most of their defensive strategy had relied on reputation and the fact that nobody wanted to challenge them. Ryan noted that the Devourers did not care about reputation and made his decision. He told Amy to send a response to the Council saying that humanity would help, but with conditions. Amy looked surprised, and Ryan continued. He said this would not be a Council operation, but a human trade alliance operation, and that the Council could join them under human command structure or face the Devourers alone. Amy smiled slightly and said that response would cause an uproar. Ryan replied that they could be upset while humanity saved their lives. He pulled up battle plans that he had been designing for years and told Amy to send a message to Captain Nicole Barnes on the Resolute. It was time to show the galaxy what human military doctrine really looked like. 72 hours later, the Devourer fleet encountered something they had not faced in 10,000 years of conquest. The Human Trade Alliance fleet did not fight like Council species who formed defensive lines and waited for the enemy to come to them. Instead, Broken Claw raiders equipped with human targeting systems struck the Devourer vanguard in hit-and-run attacks that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The Devourers tried to adapt, but every time they focused on one group of raiders, another group would strike from a different angle. The Voss had analyzed the Devourers' biomechanical ships and identified weaknesses in their command structure and power systems. Human missiles built with Corvin lithium batteries packed 3 times the punch of standard Council weapons, and they exploited those weaknesses with surgical precision. When the Devourer fleet tried to swarm and overwhelm like they had done against countless other species, they found themselves facing something truly terrifying. Human carriers were deploying thousands of small, fast, semi-autonomous fighters that moved in, patterns no organic brain could track. Captain. Nicole Barnes stood on the bridge of the Resolute and watched her fighter wings tear. Through Devourer formations like knives through paper, she ordered her pilots to target bioreactors because they did not need to destroy the Devourer ships completely, just disable them and let them drift. Her tactical officer reported that Council forces were requesting permission to join the battle line. Nicole granted permission, but made it clear they had to follow Alliance targeting solutions and combat rhythms. This was not a Council operation anymore. The battle lasted 18 hours, and when it ended, the Devourer fleet had lost 70% of its capital ships. The survivors retreated back into dark space, and their ancient hunger had finally been checked by something they never anticipated. Unity forged not from domination but from genuine partnership. The Human Trade Alliance lost 37 ships and every loss was mourned. The Council forces trying to adapt to human tactics in the middle of battle lost over 300 ships because they could not let go of their old, rigid command structures. In the aftermath, Admiral Ryan Cooper's face appeared on every screen in Council space. His message was brief and direct. He said that humanity and its allies had defended Council worlds not because the Council welcomed them or treated them fairly, but because it was the right thing to do and because billions of lives were at stake. But he made it very clear what had happened. He said the Council's ancient institutions and pride and belief in their own superiority had not stopped the Devourers. What stopped them was cooperation among equals. He said the galaxy was changing, and the Council needed to decide whether they would change with it or keep clinging to systems that no longer worked. Humanity and the Alliance would be building something new, and the Council was welcome to join as equals or not at all. When the transmission ended, the silence in the Council chamber was absolute. For the first time in 10,000 years, the species who ruled the stars understood that their age of dominance had ended, not through conquest or revolution, but through simple irrelevance. The humans had built something better and had proven it worked when it mattered most. In that silence, the Velcrene matriarch felt something she had not experienced in centuries, and that something was fear mixed with a grudging respect. The galaxy had changed, and pretending otherwise was no longer an option. 8 months after the Battle of the Velcrene Reach, the Galactic Council chamber stood waiting for something it had never expected. Today it would host not a council session, but a negotiation between equals. Jake Morrison walked through halls that had once been designed to intimidate him, and felt nothing but calm purpose. Behind him came representatives from 43 species of the Human Trade Alliance. There was Susik of the Corvin, whose people now ran the most efficient refineries in the sector. There was Commander Kresh of the Broken Claw, whose warriors had proven themselves in battle. There was Tisai of the Voss, whose mathematical genius had revolutionized fleet coordination, and dozens of others, species the Council had dismissed for centuries. In the chamber itself, the Council members waited, and their body language spoke of defeat, even if their pride would not let them admit it. The Velcrene matriarch was dimmer than before, as if the recent months had drained something essential from her. The Thaxian delegate's crystalline form showed stress fractures. Only Vexul seemed calm because he had seen this coming and tried to warn them. Jake looked around the chamber and felt a mix of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction because this moment proved humanity had been right. Sadness because it should never have come to this. The matriarch spoke first, and her voice lacked its former arrogance. She acknowledged that Jake had requested this meeting, and said the council had granted it. Jake smiled slightly at the word granted, as if they still held power here, but he did not correct her because some lessons took time to learn. He said he would be direct because that was the human way. The Human Trade Alliance was prepared to negotiate a new framework for galactic cooperation. The Thaxian delegate made a confused sound and asked if Jake meant humanity wanted to rejoin the council. Jake said no very firmly, and explained that the council as it existed was finished, and everyone knew it. Half the council members had already opened secret communications with the Alliance. Council commercial networks depended on Alliance logistics. Council defense had required the Alliance fleet to stop the Devourers. The question was not whether change was coming, but whether they would build something new together, or watch the old structure collapse completely. The matriarch asked if Jake wanted them to surrender the council. Jake replied that he wanted them to transform it into something better. Admiral Ryan Cooper stepped forward, and his presence commanded attention, even from species that had once dismissed humans as inferior. He asked the council members if they really thought they were more advanced and more capable when their 3,000-year-old defense strategy had crumbled in 18 hours. He pointed out that their economic system had required humans to maintain it without even realizing it. He said their definition of advancement seemed to mean how long they had been powerful, not how well they solved problems. The Voss had been in space for less than 2 centuries, but their calculations were better than council systems. The Corvin had been called primitive, but their resource management was superior. The Broken Claw had been labeled barbaric, but their honor made them more reliable than species that had sat in this chamber for millennia. Ryan continued and said that advancement was not about age, but about adaptation. And right now the species the council had dismissed were adapting faster than the old powers ever had. The chamber fell into uncomfortable silence until Vexwell asked what exactly humanity was proposing. Jake pulled up a holographic display showing the structure of what he called the Galactic Alliance. Not a council where some ruled and others obeyed, but a true alliance where every member species got equal representation. Trade would be negotiated fairly and transparently. Mutual defense would protect everyone, not just core worlds. Most importantly, disputed territories and resources would be governed by shared agreement, not by whoever had the most power. The matriarch's form rippled with something between anger and desperation. She asked if Jake seriously wanted to give fringe species equal say in galactic affairs. Jake corrected her and said he wanted to give all species equal say, including the council's current members. He explained that humanity was not trying to replace the council, but to save them from themselves. The galaxy was dangerous, as the Devourers had proven. There were threats that did not care about 10,000-year legacies or political structures. They just wanted to consume and destroy. The galaxy could not afford to face those threats divided. Claire Rodriguez added that the council had a choice. They could be founding members of something new and vital, or they could be the old guard clinging to a crumbling system. Either way, the galaxy was moving forward, and the only question was whether they moved with it. The matriarch asked what would happen if they refused. Jake's answer was simple and devastating. He said the Human Trade Alliance would continue without them. They would trade with those who wanted fair trade. They would defend those who stood with them. And in 20 or 50 or 100 years, the council would look around and realize the galaxy had passed them by. They would be isolated not because anyone punished them, but because they had made themselves irrelevant. It was harsh, but it was true, and everyone in the chamber knew it. The matriarch said that humanity had changed everything in just 2 years, and upended 10,000 years of galactic order. Jake replied that humanity had just exposed cracks that were already there. The order the council was mourning had not been working except for the powerful. It had failed the majority of species trying to survive and thrive. Humanity had just offered an alternative. The Thaxian delegates' form pulsed with something that might have been acceptance, and suggested they vote on whether to negotiate the terms of this galactic alliance. Around the chamber, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum, council members signaled their agreement. Not all of them, because some would cling to the old ways until the end, but enough of them agreed. More than enough. The Velcrene matriarch was the last to signal agreement, and her form shimmered with complex emotions. She said they would begin negotiations for this new age. Jake smiled and corrected her gently. Not his new age, but their new age. Something they would all build together. 6 months later, the first session of the Galactic Alliance convened in a new chamber designed very differently from the old council hall. This chamber was round, so no species sat higher than any other. Human delegates sat beside Velcrene diplomats. Corvin traders debated with Thaxian merchants. Broken Claw warriors shared tactical assessments with Meridian strategists. Admiral Ryan Cooper watched the proceedings from Earth's command center, and Amy Walsh joined him with reports. She mentioned that the first Alliance-wide defense exercise was scheduled for next month, with 70 species participating. Ryan shook his head and said he was not commanding the fleet because Commander Kresh of the Broken Claw would lead this exercise. They were taking turns with shared command for shared defense. Amy called it revolutionary, and Ryan replied that it was just common sense. On the screen, Jake Morrison was addressing the assembled alliance. He said that 2 years ago humanity had left the council chamber expecting isolation, but instead found partners. They found species who had been waiting for someone to say the old ways were not the only ways. Today they were not just 50 species, occupying the same galaxy but 50 species building a shared future together. Captain Nicole Barnes watched from the Resolute, now patrolling the frontier with a mixed crew of humans and aliens who had chosen the Alliance over their traditional paths. She raised a glass and toasted the Alliance, and her crew echoed her words. The galaxy had changed not because humanity conquered it, but because humanity offered something more dangerous than weapons. They offered an alternative. They showed that cooperation could be stronger than hierarchy, and that diversity could be strength, and that young species could teach old ones new ways of thinking. In the darkness between stars, ancient threats watched and reconsidered their plans. The galaxy had been divided and easy prey for patient hunters. Now it was united enough to fight back and strong enough to survive. On Earth, Jake Morrison looked at star charts one final time before heading home. The markers of Alliance space spread across the display like hope made visible. Not just human space anymore, but shared space and common ground. His assistant Claire paused at the door and asked if he was going home. Jake said soon because he was just appreciating what they had built. Claire corrected him and said what they had all built together. Jake smiled and agreed. What they had all built together. When humanity left the chamber, the stars had fallen quiet. But it was the quiet before dawn, and when that dawn came, it brought light to every corner of the galaxy. The old age of empires and councils had ended. The age of alliance had begun, and the galaxy would never be the same.